He was 19 years old. He had $41 in tips folded in his shirt pocket and his mother's truck idling out front with a full tank. On the night of August 9th, 1979, Wade Hollis finished mopping the floor of the all-night diner where he worked, switched off the neon sign, and was never seen alive again. That is not a story about a restless teenager who got tired of a small town and pointed that truck toward the highway. That is a story about a young man who never made it across the gravel lot to the driver's door, and about the person who was already waiting for him in the dark. It would take a box of cassette tapes in a dead man's attic, a granddaughter who refused to throw them away, and a single 40-second recording everyone had walked past for decades to finally bring that person's name into the light. But before any of that, we have to go back to that hot August night. Because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Wade Hollis was, and the town that spent 44 years certain he had simply driven off and chosen not to come home. Caddo Springs sat out on the red dirt plains of western Oklahoma, a town of maybe 1,200 where the wind never fully stopped and the grain elevator was the tallest thing for 30 miles. In 1979, it ran on wheat and cattle and oil field work, and on the kind of familiarity where the operator still connected your calls and knew your voice before you said your name. The smell of hot asphalt and cut wheat hung in the air all summer, and at night you could hear the elevator's belt running and the long moan of a semi downshifting on the highway that skirted the town's edge. People left their trucks unlocked. They left the screen door latched, but the front door open. The diner out on Route 9 ran a chalkboard tab for the regulars, and the woman who owned it knew which farmhands took their coffee black. Wade had grown up 2 miles out, the only child of a widowed mother named Laureen, who cleaned rooms at the Highway Motel. He was the dependable kind. The boy who fixed the neighbor's fence wire for nothing, who drove the church van for the older folks on Sundays, who took the late shift at the Route 9 diner the summer after he graduated and never once came home short on the till. He had a quick, crooked grin and grease under his fingernails from the engine he was always rebuilding. And that summer, for the first time, he had a plan that belonged only to him. He'd been saving in a coffee can under his bed for 2 years, and in 3 weeks he was leaving for the technical college in Weatherford to study to be a diesel mechanic. He had the acceptance letter pinned to the wall over the workbench. He was the first in his family who would ever go. He told his mother about the workbench plans the morning of the 9th. They stood in the kitchen in the early heat, and Wade laughed about how she'd have the whole truck to herself once he was gone and promised he'd be back every Sunday to drive the church van. That was the last time Laureen Hollis saw her son whole. That night he worked the closing shift, as he did every Thursday. The diner's chalkboard and the owner's account book show the last customer paid out at 11:48 p.m. By midnight, the highway was empty, and the only light for a mile was the diner's neon. Wade counted the drawer and left it locked in the back office, the way he always did. He pocketed his own tips, $41, his mother would later remember, because he'd shown her the folded bills that morning. He flipped the sign off, stepped out the side door into the gravel lot, and pulled it shut behind him. The owner, closing up the kitchen, heard the bell over the door and heard his boots on the gravel. She called out good night. He called it back. Then she heard the screen bang, and the night went quiet. And that good night was the last confirmed contact anyone had with Wade Hollis. He never started the truck. The truck was found the next morning right where Laureen had lent it to him, parked at the edge of the lot, driver's door unlocked, keys in the ignition, the full tank untouched. His acceptance letter was still pinned over the workbench at home. Nothing was taken. It was as if he had stepped out of his own life mid-stride and meant to step right back in. The county sheriff, a lean, impatient man named Roy Tackett, who'd run unopposed for 4 terms, drove out the next afternoon. By then, a dozen ranch hands were already walking the bar ditches and the wheat stubble along Route 9. Tackett looked at the truck, looked at the empty highway running west toward Texas, and decided almost on the spot what kind of case this was. A 19-year-old boy, a full tank of gas, a bag packed for college in 3 weeks. He'd seen it 100 times, he told Laureen, kids who got cold feet about leaving or couldn't wait to leave and lit out early without the nerve to say goodbye. Laureen said her son would never have left the truck she needed for work, and never without the coffee can of money still under his bed. Tackett said boys his age did foolish things, and that the money would turn up spent in Amarillo soon enough. Records from the original file, which a journalist later obtained, show how thin those first days were. No highway bulletin beyond the next county. No dogs. The $41 and the untouched college fund were noted, then waved away. A trucker who'd stopped for coffee around 11 mentioned seeing a second vehicle idling at the dark end of the lot, lights off. But the note was a single line, never followed up, the trucker never traced. Within a month, the case was effectively shelved. Wade Hollis was classified as a probable runaway, a young man who had chosen, the file said, to depart of his own accord. His mother knew better, and she said so to anyone who would listen. Laureen took the bus to the county seat and sat outside Tackett's office 2 days running until he saw her. She brought the coffee can with the money still in it. She set it on his desk and told him no boy runs from home and leaves his savings behind. Tackett told her grief made mothers stubborn and that she'd thank him for being honest when the truth came out. He wrote nothing down. There was one man who didn't shelve it. A young deputy named Owen Marsh, 27 that summer, had walked the bar ditches with the volunteers. Marsh kept circling the same details Laureen had. The unlocked truck, the keys in the ignition, the tips gone from Wade's pocket, but the diner's till untouched in the locked office. A runaway empties the till if he's taking anything. A runaway does not leave behind the one vehicle that gets his mother to work. And then there was that one-line note about the second vehicle idling in the dark. Marsh tracked down the trucker by phone and got something Tackett's file never had. The man was fairly sure the idling vehicle had been a light-colored pickup with a toolbox across the bed. Marsh typed it all up, the inconsistencies, the truck, the toolbox, in a 2-page memo and laid it on Sheriff Tackett's desk. The memo would surface decades later. Across the top, in heavy pencil, Tackett had written, "Leave it be." Marsh was young. He had a family coming. He left it be. The first real suspect came that autumn. An oil field roughneck with a temper and a record over in Texas had been working a rig outside Caddo Springs that August and had drifted on right after Wade vanished. When investigators finally looked at him the next spring, it seemed almost too tidy. No alibi anyone bothered to check. A known brawler. For a season, the town quietly settled on him, and Laureen let herself believe there would at least be a name, an arrest, an ending. Then a payroll record from the drilling company landed on Tackett's desk, and it showed the roughneck had been clocked in on a rig 400 miles south, in the Permian Basin, every single day that week, signed in by a foreman who confirmed it. He could not have been in that gravel lot. The one suspect the town had agreed on dissolved with a single phone call. And with him went the family's hope of a simple answer. There was no one else being looked at. The file went silent. The file went cold. The years did what years do out on those plains. By 1985, the Route 9 diner had changed hands twice and finally closed, its neon dark, its windows soaped over. The flyer Lorene had stapled to the elevator wall faded from the sun until you could barely read her son's name. But no one ever pulled it down. By 1990, the coffee can of money still sat under Wade's bed, untouched, because his mother could not bring herself to spend a single dollar of the future he never got to have. She kept his acceptance letter pinned over the workbench, and the half-rebuilt engine sat under a tarp in the shed for years, exactly as he'd left it. Lorene never moved. She cleaned motel rooms until her hands gave out, and she walked the gravel lot of the closed diner every August 9th, pacing off the few yards between the side door and the truck's old parking spot, the few yards her son never finished crossing. 12 steps. For 44 years, she could not understand how a strong young man could vanish in a 12-step walk across a lit gravel lot, with the owner still inside and the highway empty, and leave nothing behind but the good night he'd called over his shoulder. And Owen Marsh carried his red-penciled words, too. He served the county for 30 years, made undersheriff before he retired in 2008. And when he cleaned out his desk, he quietly kept a copy of the Hollis file. He stored it in a footlocker in his spare room. His wife asked him once why he held onto a runaway case that was never even open. He told her it wasn't a runaway, and that he'd known it wasn't in 1979, and that the worst thing he ever did in uniform was leave it be when a sheriff told him to. Every case we cover on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, court files, and the memories of the people who lived it, putting back together a real life that deserved far better than to be written off. If you want us to keep doing this work, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. Now, let's get back to Wade. The case had been cold for 43 years when a woman in Tulsa, cleaning out her late grandfather's attic in the fall of 2022, found a shoebox full of old cassette tapes she very nearly threw straight in the dumpster. Her grandfather had been a long-haul trucker, gone before she was born, and the tapes were just the rolling clutter of his life on the road. Country stations, the dispatch chatter he sometimes left running, his own voice talking to himself to stay awake. But the granddaughter was a sentimental sort, and instead of tossing them, she sat down and started playing them one by one, looking for the sound of a man she'd never met. On a tape labeled only with a date in August 1979, between a fading radio song and a long stretch of road noise, she heard her grandfather mutter something to himself about a diner he'd stopped at out on Route 9 in Oklahoma, about a kid mopping up and a truck sitting dark at the far end of the lot with somebody just sitting in it, watching, and how it gave him an odd feeling, and a man's name he thought he recognized leaning against that truck. She had no idea what any of it meant, but she was the kind of person who looked things up. She searched the date and the road and the town, and she found a single old newspaper notice about a missing local boy named Wade Hollis. And then she did the thing no one in 1979 had been able to do for Lorene. She called the sheriff's office in Caddo Springs and told them she might have her dead grandfather's voice describing the last night a missing boy was ever seen. The current sheriff listened, then made a call to a retired man 40 minutes away who he knew would want to know. Owen Marsh, now 70, drove in that same afternoon. He sat in a county office and listened to a stranger's grandfather, dead for decades, describe the light-colored pickup with someone watching from it, the exact truck Marsh had chased down in a phone call and typed into a memo a sheriff had buried in 1979. According to the people there, the old deputy had to set down his coffee and steady himself against the table. The tape alone couldn't name a killer, but it did something just as important. It reopened the case officially, and that meant the old evidence box came back out. Mislabeled and forgotten in a county annex, the box still held the inventory from Wade's truck, and sealed inside it, a set of clear lifts a careful young deputy had insisted on taking from the diner's side door frame in August of 1979. The door Wade was the last to touch. The lifts were tagged with the initials OM. No one had ever run them. In 1979, there had been nothing to run them against beyond a local card file, and they'd come back unmatched and been forgotten. The state lab in Oklahoma City ran them in 2023 against a national database that had not existed for most of Wade's mother's life. One latent print, lifted off the outside of that door frame at chest height, came back to a man with a decades-old arrest in another state. The name on the screen was not a stranger's. It was a name buried in the original 1979 file, not as a suspect, but as a helpful neighbor who had given a brief, friendly statement and then joined the volunteers walking the bar ditches the next morning. A state analyst named Priya Anand was the one who matched it. She would later say she read the cross-reference twice before she trusted it, because the man it pointed to had spent 44 years as one of the most respected figures in Caddo Springs. She called Owen Marsh before she called anyone else. The line went quiet a long moment. Then the old deputy said the name back to her, slowly. The way you say a thing, you cannot yet believe. The man was Vernon Pratt. Pratt had owned the auto shop in Caddo Springs, the only one in town. He was the man everyone trusted with their trucks, the man Wade Hollis had idolized, the master mechanic the boy had spent 2 years learning from in that shop after school. It was Pratt who'd taught Wade to rebuild the engine in the shed. It was Pratt, the file showed, who had written Wade's reference letter for the technical college in Weatherford. And it was Pratt's light-colored pickup, with the toolbox across the bed, that a trucker had seen idling dark at the end of the diner lot at midnight on August 9, 1979, and that Owen Marsh had typed into a memo a sheriff ordered him to leave be. By every account, Vernon Pratt was a cornerstone of the town. He'd run the shop for 40 years, sponsored the high school baseball team, sat on the church board, and never raised his voice that anyone could recall. When investigators began quietly pulling the threads of his life in 2023, the picture only sharpened and turned cold. Wade had been about to leave for college, leave the shop, the apprenticeship. The future, Pratt may have assumed, belonged to him. And there was a small, terrible detail buried in the shop's old ledgers. In the days right after Wade vanished, Vernon Pratt had filed an insurance claim and quietly replaced the entire bed of his pickup truck. A nearly new truck, for no reason anyone had ever asked about. Investigators got a warrant for the old Pratt property, long since sold, but never much disturbed, and out behind the tree line where the shop's burn barrel had always stood. They recovered what remained of Wade Hollis, finally bringing him home to a mother who had paced off those 12 steps every August for 44 years. Vernon Pratt was 91 years old when the state police came up the walk of his assisted living cottage. He was in a chair by the window. According to the investigators present, he did not act surprised. When they told him why they'd come, he looked out at the plains for a long while. Then he said only this: he was going to be better than me. I couldn't stand it. The arrest of a beloved town mechanic, a man who had taught the boy, written his college letter, and then walked the ditches searching for him in front of the whole town, broke over Caddo Springs like nothing in its history. People who had handed him their truck keys for 40 years, who had sat beside him in church, who had grieved Wade with him at the memorial, could not square it. Lorene Hollis, now in her 80s, learned the name from a detective who drove out to tell the family in person before the news broke. She did not cry at first, the detective said. She only asked him to say the name again because Vernon Pratt had stood in her kitchen the week Wade vanished, his hand on her shoulder, and told her he'd find her boy and bring him home. Vernon Pratt was charged with murder in the summer of 2023. He died in custody 3 months later, before the case reached a courtroom. For some in Caddo Springs, that felt like one last theft, that he should escape a jury by simple old age. But the district attorney said the thing the family needed, said aloud, on the record, in front of every camera that came to that small town, that the evidence was conclusive, that Wade Hollis never ran away, that he was taken 12 steps from his own truck by the man he trusted most in the world, and that the record of the state of Oklahoma would forever name Vernon Pratt as the one who did it. After 44 years, the file that read, "Departed of his own accord," was closed under a different word: solved. Owen Marsh was there the day they buried Wade properly in the Caddo Springs Cemetery, in the grave his mother had waited a lifetime to give him. The old deputy was 71. He brought the 2-page memo he'd typed in 1979, the one returned to him marked, "Leave it be," and after the service, he put it in Laureen's hands. He told her he was sorry it had taken his whole career and most of his life. She told him he was the only lawman who ever believed her. Wade Hollis was 19 years old. He fixed the neighbors' fences for nothing and drove the older folks to church on Sundays. He had grease under his fingernails and a crooked grin and a half-built engine under a tarp in the shed. He had saved 2 years of single dollars in a coffee can to become the first in his family to leave for college. And he meant to come home every Sunday to keep driving that church van. He had a whole life waiting for him 3 weeks down the road in Weatherford, and 12 steps of gravel between him and the truck that would have carried him toward it. And it was taken from him in a lit lot on the edge of a town where everyone knew everyone, by the one man he'd trusted to teach him how to build a future. Maybe that was the cruelest part. In a place that trusted its own so completely, the danger was never the roughneck passing through. It was the familiar hand that had taught the boy his trade. What stays with me is how close the Antdasser sat the entire time. A set of fingerprints with a careful deputy's initials, sealed in a mislabeled box, holding a name in the dark for 43 years, while a mother aged and grieved a few miles away, waiting not for a miracle, but for someone to run the card. How many cases sit like that right now, solvable today with what's already in an evidence room, if only someone opened the box? And what does it do to a town to learn that the man who searched the hardest was the one who knew exactly where to look? I'd like to know what you think. Was justice truly served when the man who took Wade died before facing a jury? Or did the naming itself, after 44 years, matter more than any sentence could? Of everything in this case, what unsettled you most? The words penciled across that memo? Or a man replacing a nearly new truck bed the week a boy disappeared? And what do you make of a town that knew everyone and still handed its trust to the one person it should have feared? Tell me in the comments. Justice found Wade Hollis after 44 years, carried there by a mother who never stopped pacing those 12 steps, a deputy who never stopped believing her, and a stranger's granddaughter who couldn't bring herself to throw away an old man's tapes. Stories like his are why this channel exists, because the truth, however late, has a way of finding the light, if someone refuses to leave it be. If you believe that too, subscribe, and you'll find more solved cases waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.